When I started using Blender many years ago, I was very interested in low poly retro style level design, and there really weren't very many great resources out there for how to actually go about doing it. Games like EverQuest and Quake and Doom, these games had fantastic level design and I was always so captivated by it. So over the last few years, I developed my own method to go about making these levels in a quick and efficient way, and I figured out, hey, why not make a video about it and show you guys how I do it. So this video assumes that you have some competency with Blender. It's not a complete beginner's guide. There's tons of resources out there. You should totally learn the program. It's a great program. Nothing we're going to do is overly complicated. You just need to know how to, grab objects, move them around, rescale them, these kinds of things. Blender's a tricky program when you start. So with all that out of the way, let's get going. The first thing we want to do is enable snapping here in the center of our screen, and then go into the Properties tab and turn on Absolute Grid Snap, Rotate, and Scale. Then we want to go into Edit mode and go to Options here in the top right and turn on Correct Face Attributes. Next, we want to enable MagicUV by going to File, Preferences, Add-on, and enable MagicUV. Now, whenever we move an object around, you can see that it's snapping in increments along our grid, so it's not ever able to get off the grid, and we can even do this with individual faces. You can also access the snap menu by pressing Shift S, and then we can press a selection to grid, and it's going to move our object back onto the grid if it's ever off grid. So this is something we want to do all the time to make sure that we're always working on grid. What Correct Face Attributes does is whenever we move our object around, it's going to automatically update our UVs based on their tiling, and we're always going to use power of 2 textures, so this is always going to automatically update. If we ever get off grid, they're going to break. That's why we want to snap back to grid and reset the UVs using UVW box projection through MagicUV. How MagicUV works is with your faces selected, hit U and then go to UVW box projection, and then we can update the scale here in the parameters tab. We always want to use integers as in whole numbers as in no decimals, so everything tiles correctly on power of 2. You may think this is a little bit limiting, but honestly we need to understand all of the rules before we can go about breaking them. So this is going to be our rule for now. Use power of 2 textures, snap to grid, and use correct face attributes so we can quickly project our texture onto our model using MagicUV box projection. So here I've added a cube with a texture that you can download in the description if you'd like to get it to follow along. The texture is numbered 1 to 8 and just helps us have a guide. So what we're going to do is resize this cube to what we want and then duplicate it across several times in order to make an outline of a floor here. Then we're just going to duplicate the floor up to act as our ceiling. Then I'm going to click this face here and press Shift S cursor to selected so I can quickly move my cursor to where I want it to go. Then I'm just going to press Shift A so I can add a new cube, and that's just going to go where my cursor is. Once we get it on grid and correct the UVs, we're going to just resize it here to act as a wall. Just move it into position, make sure it's on grid, move it up on the Z axis and the Y axis, and just make sure everything's snapped to grid. Our ceiling was a little bit low, but we fixed that with that snap to grid function. After that, all I'm going to do is duplicate these walls across so that we are able to make an enclosure for our hallway. And all I'm doing is hitting G and X or G and Y in order to lock it to the axis that I want it to be stuck to and just duplicating it across. So right here, I intentionally make this wall have an overlap. And when you look closely, you're going to see this flicker happening really bad. So let this be a lesson to never have your walls overlap or it's going to just look terrible and not work. It's a really big problem. So all you have to do whenever you see that is just move the wall, resize it, make sure that nothing is laying on top of each other. And now you can see what it's supposed to look like, and we have this nice little hallway, but it's kind of boring, so let's give it some spice. So I'm going to go out here and add a new cube, and I'm just going to throw this in the hallway real quick and resize it to about 2 by 2, and what I mean by that is you can see 5, 6, 3, 4 on the bottom there. That's 2 by 2. And then we're just going to pull it up on the Z axis and add an edge loop and try to get it somewhere we think looks pretty good. So I'm going to pull this out so we can see it a little bit better, and I think that this edge loop is a little bit too low, so I'm going to actually raise it here a little bit. I'm just going to alt click the edge, and then I'm just going to hit G and Z to move it up 1 increment, and I think that looks a lot better. I snapped it to grid, and now I'm going to duplicate it across. So now I'm going to click this face here, and then I'm going to click the corresponding face on the other piece of geometry and just hit F3 and type bridge edge loops, and that's going to make a connection here just automatically. But you're going to notice that it actually destroys our UVs here on the bottom, so we need to make sure that we account for that. So just reselect everything and do your UV correction. So now we have a very basic door frame, and let's say we wanted to make it look a little more interesting. What we could do is select these 2 edges and Control B bevel and hit C to clamp it, and then just do mouse wheel in order to make it look like this. But I don't think this is a good way to go about it because it's destructive and you can't really undo it. So what we'll do instead is select this edge and hit Shift S cursor to select it, and then Shift A to add a new cube, and then we're just going to move it into place. Since everything's on grid, it's just a matter of slowly working it into place where it needs to be. And once we get it to the right place, we're going to just make sure that it's snapped to grid and the UVs are corrected. A problem you can run into whenever trying to make a door frame like this is whenever you go about beveling this geometry here, you're going to just select this edge and Control B and then bevel it to look something like you want it to. If you were to then duplicate it across to the other side and then rotate it 180 degrees and then do snap to grid, it's actually going to just destroy your geometry, and we don't want our geometry to be destroyed. We like our geometry. What we want to do instead is have this simple cube in the top left, and then we want to also duplicate it across to the right. We don't do any beveling until we're happy with the actual simplified layout of our structure. And once it's in a position that we like, we're just going to select the edges here and then bevel them until we get something that we think looks pretty cool. And I think this looks pretty cool here. Since everything's on grid, there's not going to be any seams to the geometry, and our UVs are going to tile out perfectly. So this is an asset we could duplicate and use all across our level if we wanted to. So I'm going to repeat this process really quick in the hallway. I'm going to make sure it's on grid and its UVs are correct, and then I'm just going to resize it into the shape that I want and move it up, and then do an extrusion for a little piece at the top here, duplicate it across, and then we're going to bridge the edge loops. Then we're going to add a cube to act as our accent piece from before. Just get it into position and make sure that it's on grid and its UVs are correct, and then we're going to duplicate that across to the other side and then see about beveling it in order to look a little more interesting. Once you've got something you're happy with, we're going to see about duplicating this asset across. So let's hide the ceiling so we can see in there, and use L to select all the linked objects there, and then just duplicate it with Shift E and rotating it 90 degrees according to the hallway. And then now we've got 3 little door frames here in our room, and we can just walk through the hallway and see our work, and hey, it looks not too bad. Let's say we want to add a little bit more to this, so let's add a new cube and make sure it's on grid and the UVs are correct, and then we're just going to pull this out until we find something that looks cool to us. Now this is the part I can't really tell you too much about because this is just kind of whatever you think is cool, but this is what I thought was cool in the moment, and I bevel this hallway here. And you may be wondering how we're going to deal with that, since working with angles that aren't just right angles is a little more difficult, but don't worry, I have a secret for you. If I Alt left click these faces here, it's going to select the entire perimeter of the object, and then there are 2 faces we want to worry about, this one here and this one here. I call these entrance and exit faces because they concern themselves with connecting rooms, whereas everything else is a wall. So what we're going to do is select all of the walls, then deselect the entrance and exit faces and hit Alt E to extrude along normals. But something you'll notice here is that our faces are extruding in really weird ways because we have vertices that need to be merged. So make sure before you do this step, you hit Alt M and merge by distance. And then now our faces are going to extrude just fine. Now that we've extruded this geometry, we can select the faces that point up and then just extrude them up. And then now we're going to have a wall, and this is going to work just fine. But now we can't use this piece of geometry as our ceiling. So let's go back, and then let's actually duplicate this floor up so it can act as our ceiling. And now we can do that step where we connect the wall to be up with our ceiling. So a step that I think that's pretty important that's overlooked a lot is to take the time to actually walk through your level and see if that scale feels correct. Is there anywhere that's too busy? Is there an area that's too flat? What could make this a little more interesting than what we have now? It's really important to actually kind of immerse yourself in the level and try to understand what you're going for. Now that we've had a look and we've completed the hallway into a new room, this is where I'm going to go about separating the new room into a new object so it's separate from the hallway and we can work on it independently. So we got a good idea of what we want to do, so let's go on ahead and head into our object now, and we're going to add some cubes to do some Boolean modifiers in order to cut away some geometry. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add a cube and move it into place where we want it to be, and we want to go on ahead and get the size of it for how we want it to be and the shape and everything. There's more efficient ways to go about doing this, but we're going to keep it simple for now. So let's just bevel it and resize it, get it where we want it to be. And then we're going to select the cube that's cutting away and then select the object and hit Control- on the numpad. And you can see that that cut away into the wall. So we're just going to duplicate this across and do that modifier several times for each cube. And now we can see the results of our work where we have these nice little windows and they're all on grid and the UVs tile correctly, so we don't have any issues with these windows whatsoever. Now we want to apply these modifiers, and you'll notice that we can't apply the Boolean at the top of the stack. We have to actually go to the bottom of the stack and work our way up. So just scroll on down to the bottom here and start applying these modifiers. And then as our last step, we'll just select all of the cutaway cubes and delete them, and then now we have our finished object here. The interior of our room could use a little bit more work though, so let's add a new cube and resize it to what would be appropriate for the base of a column. And then we're going to separate the object into its own unique object so we can work with it independently. This is where the texture that we're using comes in handy. We want to inset this face in the middle to the appropriate size, and we're going to use these checkers as a grid so we can actually get it to the appropriate size. So here we just line it up as we can with these checkers, and then we're going to duplicate it up to the ceiling, and then we're going to rotate it by 180 degrees on the x-axis and just align it with the ceiling and snap it to grid. All we have to do now is select the interior faces and hit F3 and type bridge edge loops, and now we have a column automatically done for us. So how do we go about adding more columns? The naive way would be to use Shift D to duplicate it, but we're going to use Alt D instead, and that's going to create a duplicate with links, and you'll see what that does here in a second. So I'm just going to place these 4 columns in the room, and then what you're going to see is whenever I modify the parent object, the children are going to inherit that change as well. So I can modify the top here and all of them are going to change. This is a really good method to use whenever you want to have the base property of an object replicated across the scene multiple times, because after you do this, you can go about fine-tuning each individual object to be a little different from the other ones. So after doing a slight bevel to the parent object, all the children inherited that change, and then now what we're going to do is select all of these children and then select the parent and press Ctrl J so they all merge together, and then we're going to merge that object back into our parent object as in the terrain. So now I can go in here and just tweak every little individual column to be just a little bit different from the other ones so they feel unique, but they were all made from that same original base column. Let's see about adding an exit to our room. So let's add a cube similar to how we've done door frames before and just get it sized and aligned with where we want it to be using snap to grid and UV correction. And once we get the height that we're happy with, let's just bridge the edge loops, and we're going to do something a little bit different this time. We're going to add another cube, and it's just going to act as an elongated bar to act as a divider and just make the doorway feel a little bit differently than the other ones. And once we're happy with it, we're just going to add another cube, and instead of doing the manual resize, I'm just going to hit scale 0.5 to scale this cube in half, and that's going to give us the exact size that we need based on the grid of everything else. We still have to make sure everything's on grid though, so we had to move these bars just a little bit before we start adding the bevels here. So now that we've got everything correct, we're just going to add this geometry here and do our bevel on our door frame similar to before, and then we're going to see about adding a little bit more detail. So I had the idea with these little slits in the door to just add a face in between here so we could use a different texture on it later. Something to keep in mind though is whenever you do this, sometimes your faces can get flipped, so make sure you check this. I can notice that my numbers are backwards there on the screen, and I just go to face mode and quickly check that my normals were inverted there, so I fix those. After walking around the room for a little while, I decided this corner needed something a little more interesting, so I'm just going to add a cube and give it a slight bevel once I move it into place. And this is going to act as just a little bit of a round object just to kind of break up the monotony of all the flat spaces. Once we finally get it into position, just snap it to grid and correct the UVs. So hopefully by this point you've gotten the idea that we're just using basic cubes all over the place in order to add accents and trims and these kinds of things to the level. And everything really is just made out of basic cubes. We go in later and do these bevels and everything to make it look a little bit more interesting. But the base of the idea is we just use cubes to lay out the room and get the general flow of everything, and only afterwards do we start to add detail. My normal workflow would be to sketch this entire room with just cubes. I wouldn't be doing any of the detail work that you've seen throughout this video until I was completely satisfied with the layout. So the detail that you see on all these door frames and columns and the holes in the walls there, that's not stuff I would normally do until later. So just keep that in mind whenever you're trying to learn this style. Just start simple. It's okay for it to look really simple and just cube based for a long time, because it's at the end that we're going to go see about making it look more interesting. So the final thing I'm going to do in this room is to add another little cube here, and we're going to elevate this floor a little bit so we could have a monster maybe standing on this platform. So I've just added a flattened cube and beveled it, and then I just duplicated it up and then resized it a little bit so there can be a two-step terrace here for a mob to stand on, and it really draws the attention of the player up there because it's elevated, right? So we're going to do a final walkthrough of our level and show what we've created in a relatively short time. If you like this content, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I would love to make more low poly retro style level design content, as this is something I'm just incredibly passionate about, and there's so much to this. It's such a rabbit hole and there's so much you can learn. So thank you guys, and I hope you have a great day.